Hello, I'm Richard Murphy, and I want to talk about the UK tax gap, or rather the fact that HM Revenue and Customs, our tax authority, has just announced, rather quietly, that it's actually looking at recalculating the way that they estimate the UK tax gap. So let's first of all talk about what the tax gap is. The tax gap is the difference between the amount of tax that should be paid to HM Revenue and Customs each year as a result of the laws that we have in operation and the amount of economic activity that takes place in our economy and the amount of tax they actually get each year. Now, there's always a difference, and unsurprisingly the difference is always negative. In other words, the revenue always lose money, and nothing on earth is ever going to stop there being that difference. There's always going to be less money collected than there should be because cheats will always be with us. But of course, the objective of our tax authority is to minimise that risk. And the risk arises for three reasons. One is tax evasion, that is literally people not telling HM Revenue and Customs that they are in business, or alternatively claiming costs in their accounts which they're not entitled to, either way reducing the tax bill that they really owe. The second way is tax avoidance, which is largely done by wealthy people and large companies, which is where they exploit loopholes in tax law in clever ways advised on by accountants and lawyers to try to reduce their tax bills in ways that Parliament never imagined the law would be used. And the third way in which the tax gap arises is simply because, well, taxpayers and companies go bust and can't afford to settle the bills that they owe even if they've declared them. This is most common in the case of companies, but not only companies, of course, personal insolvencies happen too. So for those three reasons, money isn't collected. Now, I've been working on estimating this tax gap since 2006, which is longer than most people in the UK, because back then, this issue was almost not talked about, and HM Revenue and Customs didn't really publish estimates of the tax gap at that time. I began looking at how much companies weren't paying, but by 2010 I was beginning to publish estimates across the board of how much is not paid. And by and large, I've estimated that around £100 billion a year in tax is not paid, of which around 80 billion is tax evasion, around 15 billion is probably tax avoidance, and maybe 5 billion is, as a result of corporate insolvency and so on, bad debt. Now, HM Revenue and Customs have always disagreed with me. Since 2010, when they've been regularly publishing, to their credit, an annual estimate of the tax gap, and they are the only tax authority in the world to publish an annual tax gap. So I do give them credit for doing that. They've said that the tax gap throughout that period has been around £35 billion. Quite extraordinarily, it's hardly varied by more than 2 or 3 billion a year over the whole decade. But I think they're wrong, and I've always said they're wrong. And the reason why I've said they're wrong is that HM Revenue and Customs make a quite extraordinary assumption when they calculate their tax gap. In the UK, it's a simple fact that most people don't have to submit a tax return. Around 10 million people in the UK are now asked to submit tax returns a year. I say around because it's near enough. And there are around 33 million taxpayers in the UK. Amongst UK companies, of which there are over 4.5 million, around 2 million are actually asked to submit a corporation tax return. So again, something less than half are actually asked to submit for all sorts of reasons. Now that is an extraordinary situation. Vast numbers of taxpayers aren't asked to submit tax returns to confirm what their income might be. The obvious way in that case for anyone who doesn't want to declare their income is to simply not put it on a tax return, which is easy because they haven't got a tax return to submit. And because they haven't got a tax return to submit, they can sort of satisfy their own conscience by saying, well, nobody asked me, so I didn't say. It's an easy get out. Contrast this with the USA. In the USA, every single person has to submit a tax return, and the penalties for not doing so are pretty horrible. And the IRS, which is the tax authority in the USA, is also pretty fearsome when it comes to investigating people who make tax mistakes. And every company has to submit a tax return. A totally different approach to that in the UK. Now, I personally think that we should actually have a requirement that every company in the UK should submit a tax return, and ideally every individual should too. Although, I'll be clear, I think that actually HM Revenue and Customs should go out of their way to help us do that, because they have, for the vast majority of people, all the information that is needed to put on a tax return each year. Details of their employment, details of their benefits, details of their pensions, details of their savings income, and could pre-populate that on a tax return and send it to people to confirm it was accurate, which is, by the way, how Sweden does its tax return system. So it is entirely possible we could have 100% tax returns, but we would change the focus of the tax gap as a result. But my point is this. HM Revenue and Customs have, when they've been calculating the tax gap, been using a US model of estimation. Now, they've said if they find an error in a tax return, they will extrapolate that error. That means literally they'll assume it's happened in every other tax return. So if they sample 1,000 tax returns to find how many errors there are, and by the way, many of the samples are as small as 1,000, to find out how big the errors are in tax returns, they'll then spread that error across the 10 million personal tax returns they get and say that gives them an accurate figure of the missing tax. The trouble is that model was created for use in the USA, where everyone submitted a tax return. So as a result, because HMRC only spread their errors over 1/3 of the population, they come up with a tax gap which is 1/3 of the figure that I come up with. Literally, this explains why their figures for tax lost are 1/3 of the size of those that I come up with. I believe that the method that I've used, which has taken a totally different approach and looked at the tax loss within the framework of what I call the macro economy, the total figures for GDP, gross domestic product in this country, and what makes it up and what should be paid on those and what isn't, gives rise to a fair estimate of the tax gap, and have always struggled to explain why HMRC have got it wrong, except for this obvious fact that they don't get tax returns from everybody. Well, finally, HM Revenue and Customs have said they're going to review their model, having recognised that they are actually understating the tax gap because they've used this US model, which assumes 100% of people make tax returns when only 1/3 of people do, and they've got to correct for that. When they do, I'm expecting that they will recognise that there is a much bigger tax gap than they've ever previously admitted. And that's important, because when you recognise the scale of the problem, you allocate resources to it. And when you allocate resources to it, you begin to collect more tax. And that is good for us. It's good because it is the cheats who are undermining the honest businesses that really need to survive in our economy, that are actually creating harm, who need to make payment. Honest business can't prosper if it's literally competing with cheats in the next door building. Everybody has to pay their taxes to create a fair and honest competitive marketplace in which all can survive on the basis of the quality of the goods and services they supply, and not upon their ability to cheat. This is a pro-business, pro-honest tax strategy that HM Revenue and Customs should have done a long time ago and now need to invest in. If they do, we'll end up with a more vibrant economy as a consequence. And that's always been my goal. I'm Richard Murphy. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to this video series on YouTube if you're interested. Also look for us on Facebook. I am on Twitter @Richard J. Murphy. And at the same time, look at my blog, Tax Research UK, where you can find much more on these themes. And I'll see you again soon.